The sun dipped low over Malibu, casting a golden glow on Tony Stark's cliffside mansion. Inside the sprawling lab, the air buzzed with energy. Screens glowed with schematics. Robotic arms whirred as they assembled parts. And Tony Stark, clad in a grease-streaked tank top, leaned over a sleek cylindrical machine, his hands moving with meticulous precision. "Jarvis," Tony said, his voice edged with excitement. "Give me the status report on the stabilization matrix." The AI's calm British voice responded instantly. "The matrix is currently at 87% optimization, sir. However, the probability of molecular instability during live testing remains above acceptable thresholds." Tony waved a dismissive hand. "Above acceptable thresholds is where innovation happens, Jarvis. We're not going to revolutionize travel by playing it safe." He stepped back to admire his latest creation, the Stark Industries teleportation array. Two circular pods sat on either side of the lab, connected by a network of cables and glowing blue conduits. Pepper Potts entered the lab, heels clicking against the polished floor. She stopped short when she saw the pods, her brow furrowing in concern. "Tony, what is this?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Only the future of human transportation," Tony said, grinning. "Imagine it. Instantaneous travel. No traffic, no fuel costs, no emissions. Just step into one of these beauties and bam, you're anywhere in the world." Pepper's eyes narrowed. "You mean another device that could explode or accidentally vaporize someone? Did you forget what happened with your first Iron Man prototype?" "That was different," Tony said, waving off her concern. "This is under control." Pepper didn't look convinced. "What does Rhodey think about this?" Tony smirked. "Rhodey thinks I'm a genius who's going to change the world, but he also thinks I'm an idiot for not taking a vacation. I'm choosing to focus on the first part." Pepper sighed, her tone softening. "Tony, just be careful. You're not invincible." Tony's grin faltered slightly. "Noted. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a date with history." Later that night, the lab was quiet, save for the hum of the teleportation array. Tony stood between the two pods, holding a glass of scotch in one hand and a wrench in the other. "All right, Jarvis," he said, his voice tinged with anticipation. "Let's run a full system diagnostic." "System diagnostic initiated," Jarvis replied. "All systems nominal, ready for testing." Tony took a deep breath, setting his glass aside. "Here goes nothing." He stepped into the first pod, the circular door hissing shut behind him. The interior was stark and metallic, illuminated by faint blue lights. "Beginning sequence," Jarvis announced. The machine hummed to life, its conduits glowing brighter as energy coursed through them. The air inside the pod grew thick, vibrating with an almost imperceptible hum. Unbeknownst to Tony, a small black fly had entered the chamber moments before the door closed. It buzzed frantically, unnoticed as it landed on the back of Tony's neck. Energizing in 3, 2, 1. The pod filled with light, and Tony felt his body dissolve into a strange weightless sensation. When the second pod opened, Tony stumbled out, clutching the edge of the frame. His head spun, and his legs felt unsteady beneath him. "Whoa," he muttered, shaking his head. "That was a rush." "Teleportation successful," Jarvis reported. "All systems functioning within expected parameters." Tony straightened, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. "I did it," he said, his voice filled with awe. "Jarvis, we just changed the game." But as he stepped away from the pod, his vision blurred, and a strange itch crept across his neck. He rubbed at the spot absent-mindedly, dismissing it as nothing more than nerves. "Time to celebrate," Tony said, heading upstairs. But as the lab lights dimmed behind him, the faint buzzing of a fly echoed in the empty space. A week after the first teleportation test, Stark Industries was abuzz with activity. Obadiah Stane stood at the head of the boardroom table, his imposing figure commanding attention. The gathered executives, though confident in Stane's leadership, exchanged uneasy glances as his speech veered into uncharted territory. Tony has been working tirelessly to push the boundaries of science, Stane said, his voice smooth and reassuring. But it's clear to all of us that his eccentricity has become a distraction. Stark Industries needs stability, and as his closest ally, I intend to ensure that our company remains a beacon of innovation and strength. The room murmured in agreement. Stane spread his hands, his smile a polished mask of sincerity. We've weathered storms before, and we'll do it again, with or without Tony's constant involvement. Down in his Malibu lab, Tony was oblivious to the power play unfolding above him. He leaned over the teleportation array, his movements jittery and uncoordinated. "Jarvis," he muttered, staring at a screen filled with incomprehensible data. "Why can't I figure this out? The tests worked, but the stabilization curve's off. It doesn't make sense." Jarvis responded cautiously. "Perhaps you're overextending yourself, sir. You haven't slept in 3 days, and your recent physical changes..." "Physical changes," Tony snapped, his voice sharp. "What are you talking about?" Jarvis paused. "You've been exhibiting increased reflexes and strength, as well as abnormal shifts in appetite and behavior." Tony waved a dismissive hand. "It's nothing, just stress. I've got the weight of the world on my shoulders, remember?" But even as he said it, he couldn't ignore the nagging itch at the back of his neck or the strange twitch in his hand. Later that day, Pepper Potts found Tony in the kitchen, wolfing down a massive pile of food with alarming speed. Plates of half-eaten sandwiches, bowls of pasta, and even a jar of peanut butter were strewn across the counter. "Tony," Pepper said, her voice cautious, "are you okay?" Tony looked up, his face flushed, and his eyes unnaturally bright. "I'm fine," he said, though his tone was edged with irritation. "Just hungry." Pepper's brow furrowed. "You've been avoiding meetings, ignoring calls, and now this. What's going on?" Tony ran a hand through his hair, wincing as he accidentally pulled out a small clump. "I told you, I'm fine. Stop hovering." Pepper's concern deepened. "Tony, this isn't like you. Let me help." Tony stood abruptly, his movements too fast and jerky. "You want to help? Then let me work. I'm onto something big, Pepper. Bigger than Iron Man. Bigger than anything I've ever done." Pepper hesitated, her eyes scanning his disheveled appearance. "All right," she said softly. "But promise me you'll see a doctor." "Sure," Tony said dismissively, already turning back to his work. "Whatever you say." That evening, Tony sat alone in the lab, staring at his reflection in a polished piece of metal. His skin looked different, paler, with a faint sheen that caught the light in an unnatural way. He scratched at his neck, and his fingers brushed against a strange bump. His heart raced as he rushed to a nearby mirror, tilting his head to get a better look. The bump was small, but unmistakably wrong. Something hard and chitinous pressing against his skin. "Jarvis," Tony said, his voice shaking. "Run a full-body scan, now!" The lab scanner activated, bathing Tony in blue light. When the results appeared on the screen, his stomach dropped. The scan showed anomalies throughout his body, heightened muscle density, altered cellular structure, and traces of foreign DNA. "What the hell is this?" Tony whispered, his mind racing. "Preliminary analysis suggests a genetic mutation," Jarvis replied. The cause is unclear, but it may be related to your recent teleportation test. Tony's chest tightened as the pieces clicked into place. The fly, he muttered. There was a fly in the pod. He staggered back, his legs giving out beneath him. This isn't happening, he said, his voice barely audible. But the evidence was undeniable. The teleportation array had fused his DNA with that of the fly. Meanwhile, at Stark Industries headquarters, Obadiah Stane held a press conference. Cameras flashed as he stood at the podium, his expression solemn. Tony Stark is a brilliant man, Stane said, his voice heavy with feigned concern. But his recent behavior has raised questions about his ability to lead this company. Rest assured, Stark Industries will continue to thrive under my guidance. Together we'll ensure that Tony's vision lives on. The crowd erupted into applause, but behind closed doors, Stane's true agenda was clear. With Tony spiraling out of control, it was only a matter of time before he took full control of Stark Industries. In his lab, Tony stared at his reflection, his hands trembling. His face was still his own, but for how long? I can fix this, he said, his voice cracking. I just need time. But deep down, he knew the clock was ticking. The transformation was impossible to ignore. Tony stood in his workshop, gripping a metal rod in both hands. With a sharp, effortless twist, he bent the thick steel into a U shape. He stared at the deformed metal, a mixture of awe and horror flashing across his face. Jarvis, he said, his voice strained, log that. Another strength increase. We're past human limits. Logged, sir, Jarvis replied. However, I must remind you that your physical enhancements are accompanied by an accelerated rate of mutation. The changes appear to be spreading. Tony wiped his brow, his fingers brushing against a patch of rough, bristly hairs, sprouting along his arm. He yanked at them, wincing as they tore free. Noted, he muttered. The lab was a wreck. Half-finished projects and discarded plates of food were scattered across the floor. The teleportation array loomed in the center, its once sleek design now marred by hastily added wires and panels. Tony hunched over the array's control console, his fingers flying across the keyboard. His mind raced with ideas, calculations spilling out faster than he could process them. He had to fix this. Reverse the polarity, he murmured, typing furiously. No, recalibrate the molecular oscillator first. Damn it! A sharp pain shot through his hand, and he pulled it back to see his fingernail splitting down the middle. Blood and a viscous yellow fluid oozed from the wound. Tony slammed his fist against the console, his breathing ragged. Come on, Stark, you're smarter than this. You can beat it. While Tony's desperation grew, Obadiah Stane was thriving. Stane strolled through Stark Industries' main office, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with the board members. His demeanor was calm and confident, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing in Malibu. I'll be meeting with the Department of Defense tomorrow, Stane told a junior executive. They're concerned about Tony's erratic behavior, but I assured them that Stark Industries remains a pillar of stability. Behind his polished facade, Stane's mind was already plotting his next move. Tony's absence had created an opportunity, one Stane intended to exploit fully. That evening, Rhodey arrived at Tony's mansion, his face etched with concern. He entered the lab cautiously, his gaze sweeping over the disarray. Tony, Rhodey called. From the shadows, Tony emerged, his appearance shocking even to Rhodey. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and glistening with an unnatural sheen. His movements were quick and jittery, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. Rhodey, Tony said, his voice hoarse, but tinged with manic energy. Glad you're here. I've got it. The solution. I'm close. Rhodey approached slowly, his hand hovering near his holstered sidearm. Close to what? Tony, what's happening to you? Tony's laugh was sharp and humorless. An upgrade, apparently. Stronger, faster, smarter. But it's messy. Still working out the kinks. He held up his hand, revealing the grotesque changes. Elongated fingers covered in small, hair-like bristles. Rhodey's expression hardened. Jesus, Tony. You need help. I need time, Tony snapped, turning back to the console. Time to reverse this. I just need... A violent shudder ran through his body, and he doubled over, gasping. When he straightened, his eyes were bloodshot, his teeth grinding audibly. Rhodey stepped forward, his voice firm. You're not fixing this alone. Let me call someone. No, Tony shouted, slamming his hand on the console. The impact left a dent in the metal. I can fix it. No one else can. Just stay out of my way. Later, alone in the lab, Tony stared at himself in a cracked mirror. His reflection was barely recognizable. Patches of coarse black hair covered his arms and neck. His jawline was sharper, his cheekbones protruding unnaturally. His once pristine hands trembled with involuntary spasms. Pepper was right, he muttered to himself, his voice hollow. I'm not invincible. The teleportation array hummed behind him, its lights flickering erratically. Tony turned to face it, his expression hardening. But I'm not done yet. At a press event the next day, Obadiah Stane addressed the media. His tone was grave, but his words carried an undertone of triumph. Tony Stark is a brilliant man, Stane said, but even geniuses can lose their way. Stark Industries is committed to maintaining its legacy of innovation and integrity, and I will personally ensure that our future remains bright. The crowd erupted into applause, but in the shadows, Stane's true intentions simmered. He didn't need to save Stark Industries. He needed it for himself. And with Tony spiraling out of control, it was only a matter of time before the company was his. In the lab, Tony worked tirelessly, his body deteriorating as his mind raced. The line between man and monster blurred further with each passing moment, but Tony refused to give in. I'm still me, he whispered, his voice trembling. I'm still Tony Stark. But the buzzing in his ears, growing louder and more insistent, suggested otherwise. The lab was unrecognizable. The teleportation array pulsed erratically, its conduits crackling with unstable energy. Tools and scraps of metal littered the floor, while charts filled with incoherent equations were plastered across the walls. In the center of it all stood Tony Stark, or what was left of him. His transformation was nearly complete. His skin had darkened to a sickly grayish green, his limbs elongated and sinewy. His fingers ended in jagged insect-like claws, and his face was a grotesque amalgam of human and fly, with compound eyes glinting in the dim light. Tony leaned over the console, his movements jerky and twitching. The buzzing in his head had become constant, a maddening symphony that drowned out coherent thought. Jarvis, Tony rasped, his voice distorted and guttural. Status on the containment matrix. Jarvis's voice was calm, but tinged with concern. The matrix is nearing critical failure, sir. I must advise against further use of the array. Tony's claws scraped against the console, leaving deep gouges in the metal. I'm not stopping. Not until I fix this. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the lab, and Tony's head snapped up, his compound eyes narrowing. Tony, Obadiah Stane's voice called out, calm and patronizing. Are you in here? Tony turned to see Stane entering the lab, flanked by two Stark Industries security personnel. He was dressed in his usual crisp suit, his expression a careful blend of concern and smug satisfaction. Obi, Tony hissed, his mandibles clicking involuntarily. Came to check on me, or to see if the vultures can start circling. Stain raised his hands in mock surrender. Easy, Tony. I'm here to help. Everyone's worried about you, and frankly, I can see why. His eyes flicked over Tony's mutated form, his expression unreadable. You've been busy. Tony's claws tightened into fists. Don't play the concerned mentor, Stain. I know what you're doing. Stain's calm facade cracked, his lips curling into a smirk. You've always been sharp, Tony, but look at you now, half man, half monster. Stark Industries can't survive with you at the helm. Tony took a step forward, his movements unsettlingly quick. And you think you're the solution? You're just waiting for me to fall so you can grab the throne. Stain chuckled, the sound cold and devoid of humor. Waiting? Oh, Tony, I'm not waiting for anything. He pressed a button on a device in his hand, and the far wall of the lab slid open, revealing a massive suit of armor. It was a modified version of the Ironmonger's suit, sleeker, more advanced, and bristling with weapons. I've already won, Stain said, climbing into the armor. You're just too far gone to see it. The Ironmonger's suit powered up, with a deafening roar, its glowing eyes locking onto Tony. Stain's voice boomed through the suit's speakers, dripping with condescension. Step aside, Tony. I'll take it from here. Tony's body twitched violently, his monstrous instincts fighting to take over. You want the company, Stain, he growled. Come and take it. Stain fired a missile, the explosive projectile screaming toward Tony. But Tony's reflexes, now enhanced to an inhuman degree, sent him darting out of the way with terrifying speed. The missile exploded against the teleportation array, sending a shower of sparks raining down. Tony lunged at Stain, his claws raking across the suit's armor with a screech of metal on metal. The battle was brutal and chaotic. Stain unleashed a barrage of weapons, missiles, repulsor blasts, and electrified nets, but Tony's agility made him a nearly impossible target. He leapt onto the Ironmonger's suit, his claws digging into the joints and tearing out wires. Not bad, Tony, Stain taunted, swinging a massive armored fist that sent Tony flying across the lab. But you're not the genius you used to be, just a monster playing hero. Tony staggered to his feet, his mandibles twitching. Better a monster than a parasite, he snarled, darting forward and slamming into the suit with enough force to crack the chest plate. The lab continued to deteriorate as the fight raged on. The teleportation array, now critically unstable, emitted bursts of energy that tore through the room, disintegrating equipment and blowing out walls. Stain grabbed Tony in one massive hand, lifting him off the ground. Look at you, he sneered. Is this what you wanted? To become a freak? You're no better than the machines you build. Tony struggled, his claws flailing against the suit's grip. Machines don't betray people, he growled, his voice raw with anger. With a sudden burst of strength, Tony tore free, landing on the console beside the array. His compound eyes flicked to the sparking device, an idea forming in his fractured mind. Tony turned to Stain, his voice a guttural roar. You want Stark Industries? Take it. But you're not taking my future. Before Stain could respond, Tony slammed his clawed hand onto the array's control panel, initiating the overload sequence. The array erupted with a blinding surge of energy, engulfing the lab in a vortex of light and heat. The lab was chaos incarnate. The teleportation array's energy output had gone critical, tearing through the room in waves of blinding blue light. Walls crumbled, conduits exploded, and the air crackled with raw power. Tony stood on the console beside the array, his grotesque form silhouetted against the swirling vortex of energy. His mandibles twitched, his compound eyes darting between the device and the hulking ironmonger's suit that was advancing on him. "Tony!" Stain roared through his suit's speakers, his voice distorted by static. "You're going to destroy everything!" Tony's distorted voice rang out, laced with fury and defiance. "Better everything than letting you win." Stain raised his arm, a repulsor blast charging in his gauntlet. "Don't make me do this." "Do it," Tony spat. The repulsor beam fired, striking Tony square in the chest. He staggered, his monstrous form jerking backward. But he didn't fall. Instead, he lunged forward, slamming into the ironmonger's suit with enough force to topple it. The two crashed to the floor, the impact shaking the lab. Stain struggled to right himself, his suit sparking and groaning under the strain. Tony, his claws digging into the armor, leaned in close, his mandibles clicking menacingly. "You were never a hero," Tony hissed, "and you never will be." With a final burst of strength, Tony ripped out a vital component from the suit's chest, disabling it. Stain let out a cry of frustration as the ironmonger's suit went limp, collapsing to the ground. The teleportation array roared behind Tony, its energy spiraling out of control. Tony turned to face it, his monstrous form backlit by the swirling light. "Jarvis," he rasped, his voice trembling with effort. "Can we contain it?" Jarvis's calm voice was tinged with regret. "Containment is no longer possible, sir. The array will detonate within 3 minutes, releasing an energy wave capable of devastating the surrounding area." Tony clenched his claws, his mind racing. What about redirecting the energy back through the system? "Redirecting the energy is possible," Jarvis replied, "but doing so would require manual intervention within the array's core. The probability of survival is negligible." Tony let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Negligible is better than impossible." Pepper's voice crackled through a nearby intercom, cutting through the chaos. "Tony, what's happening? Are you okay?" Tony hesitated, his distorted reflection staring back at him in a shattered piece of glass. He could barely recognize himself anymore, the monster he'd become. He pressed a clawed hand to the intercom. "Pepper, I need you to know something." "Tony, what are you talking about?" Pepper's voice was frantic. "You're scaring me." Tony closed his eyes, his mandibles clicking softly. "I screwed up, big time, but I'm going to make it right." The intercom cut out as Tony stepped toward the array, his monstrous form illuminated by its brilliant light. Inside the array, the energy was blinding, the heat searing. Tony's body convulsed as he stepped into the core, his mutated skin blistering and peeling under the intense pressure. "Jarvis," Tony muttered, his voice weak but determined. "Begin redirection." "Yes, sir," Jarvis replied, his tone solemn. Tony gripped the central conduit, his claws digging into the metal. The energy surged through him, tearing at what little humanity remained. His vision blurred, and the buzzing in his head reached a deafening crescendo. But through the pain, a memory surfaced, a fragment of his former self. "I am Iron Man," he whispered, his voice cracking. With a final desperate scream, Tony activated the redirection sequence. The array erupted in a burst of light, the energy wave collapsing inward as it was funneled back into the system. The lab was consumed by the vortex, the walls and equipment disintegrating into nothingness. When the light finally faded, the lab was silent. Hours later, Pepper and Rhodey arrived at the scene, their expressions grim as they surveyed the smoldering ruins of the lab. "Anything?" Rhodey asked, his voice heavy. Pepper shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. "No sign of him." Rhodey placed a hand on her shoulder, his own grief evident. "He saved us, Pepper. He saved everyone." Pepper nodded, clutching a small piece of twisted metal she'd found. A fragment of the teleportation array, engraved with the Stark Industries logo. In the weeks that followed, Stark Industries began to rebuild. Stane's betrayal was exposed, and he was arrested for his crimes. The world mourned the loss of Tony Stark, but his legacy lived on, not just in his technology, but in the lesson his sacrifice had taught. Some lines shouldn't be crossed, no matter how brilliant the mind behind them. As the sun set over the remains of Tony's mansion, a faint, buzzing sound echoed through the air. For a brief moment, a shadow flitted across the wreckage, small, winged, and almost human. Then it was gone.